What Jesus Had to Say by James M. Robinson. We need to face up to an undomesticated Jesus, what one might call a real idealist, a committed radical, in any case, a profound person who proposed a solution to the human dilemma. What Jesus had to say centered around the ideal of God's rule, the kingdom of God, the main theological category Jesus created. Calling the ideal God's rule puts it in an antithetical relation both to other political and social systems and to individual self-interest, looking out for number one. Jesus points out that the ravens and wildflowers prosper without working to secure their needs. God cares about every sparrow sold a dime a dozen. God will not give a stone when asked for bread, or a snake when asked for fish, but can be counted on to give what one really needs. Indeed, people should trust God to know what they need even before they ask. This utopian vision was the core of what Jesus had to say. It was both good news, reassurance that good would happen to undo one's plight in actual experience, and the call upon people to do that good in actual practice. The human dilemma is in large part that we are each other's fate. We are the tool of evil that ruins the other person as we look out for number one, having long abandoned any youthful idealism we might once have cherished. But if I would cease and desist from pushing you down to keep myself up, and you, for your part, would do the same, then the vicious circle could be broken. Society would become mutually supportive rather than self-destructive. Count on God to look out for you, to provide people that will care for you, and listen to Him when He calls on you to provide for them. This radical trust in and responsiveness to God is what makes society function as God's society. This is, for Jesus, what faith and discipleship were all about. Nothing else has a right to claim any functional relationship to Him. Put in language derived from His sayings, I am hungry because you hoard food. You are cold because I hoard clothing. So we are all to get rid of our backpacks and wallets. Such security is to be replaced by God's rule, which means both what we trust God to do, to tell the other person to share food with me, and what we hear God telling us to do, to share clothing with the other person. One does not carry money while passing by the poor, or a backpack full of extra clothes and food while ignoring the cold and hungry lying in the gutter. This is why the beggars, the hungry, the depressed are fortunate. God, that is to say, those who hearken to God, those in whom God rules, will care for them. They are called upon to trust that God's rule is there for them. Theirs is the kingdom of God. One need not even carry a club for self-protection, but rather should return good for evil, even with regard to one's enemies. One turns the other cheek. God is the kind of person who provides sunshine and rain even to those who oppose Him. So God's children are those who care even for their enemies. In the original form of the Lord's Prayer, what followed directly upon and defined Thy kingdom come was, Give us this day our daily bread. People should ask for no more than a day's ration of food, trusting God to provide for today, and then trusting for tomorrow. God's rule, the kingdom of God, was interpreted by Matthew's community to mean, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This addition to the Lord's Prayer is, technically speaking, not a call for action, but, like Thy kingdom come, which it interprets, an appeal to God. When one prays, one trusts in God to answer, but God answers by motivating people to turn the other cheek, to give the shirt off one's back, to lend, expecting nothing in return. The person who prays to God for help is the same person whom God motivates to help. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Part of God ruling is helping the infirm with whatever medicine was available. One went from door to door, and if admitted for bed and breakfast, the answer to the prayer for a day's bread, one placed God's blessing on the house, in practice by healing the sick within as best one could. Heal the sick and say, the kingdom of God has drawn near. Just as the sharing of food and clothing, the canceling of debts, the non-retaliation against enemies were not seen as human virtues, but rather as God acting through those who trust Him, just so healings were not attributed to a witch doctor's or a magician's individual technique or skill, but to God making use not only of Jesus, but of others as well. Clearly, all these were things that one could not oneself do, from renunciation of self-interest to healing disease. They took place because God was doing it. God was ruling in this unusual human society. This was, in fact, the coming of the kingdom of God. Jesus was a faith healer in the sense that he trusted God to thrust his finger into the human dilemma, the coming of God's rule, to overcome the plight of the infirm. But not everything had been done. Not all people lived such trust in God. Not all the helpless were helped, nor all the disabled healed. Of course, one trusted God to follow through to completion, eschatology. But Jesus' message was not intended to replace grim reality with a pie-in-the-sky, by-and-by utopian ideal, but rather to focus attention on trusting God for today's ration of life, and on hearing God's call to give life now to one's neighbor. All this is as far from today's Christian coalition and even mainline Christianity as it was from the Judaism practiced in Jesus' day. The hardest saying of Jesus is, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but do not do what I say?" One laments the absence of a high Christology, any claim by Jesus in his sayings to be divine. But what could be higher than the belief that doing Jesus' word is what acquits in the day of judgment? Christological creeds may be no more than pious dodges to avoid this unavoidable condition of discipleship. Actually do what he said to do. People do not do what he said, not simply because of the shift in cultural conditions, but ultimately because people do not trust God as Jesus did, in spite of claims to Christian faith. This, not the Jesus Seminar's shocking negations, is what should be unsettling about finding out what Jesus had to say. All this, of course, sounds incredibly naive. Once Jesus launched himself into this lifestyle, practicing what he preached, he did not last long. A reality check is called for. Yet the bottom line is not necessarily so cynical. In concentration camps, cells of a few who can really trust each other, due to a shared ethnic, religious, or political commitment, and who are hence willing to give an extra portion of their meager food and other necessities of life to the feeblest, have turned out to have a higher chance of survival than do individuals looking out only for themselves. Selfishness may ultimately turn out to be a luxury we can ill afford. There is a paradoxical saying to the effect that when one saves one's life, one loses it, but when one loses one's life, one saves it. To be sure, the point here is not longevity, but integrity. What Jesus had to say is thus all the more worthy of serious consideration.